So welcome to the third and final session of the Black Metropolis Research Consortium's 2021 Fellows Research Presentation Series. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the Fellows Program at the BMRC, annually we do have an international competitive application and selective process for a 1 month summer short-term residential fellowship here in Chicago that we offer. So the program is now in its 12th year and has engaged scholars, artists, writers, public historians, all to better formulate new historical narratives of Chicago's Black past and history. Today, we will hear from 3 of the BMRC fellows from the 2020-2021 cohort, and they are Lanie Adolfson of Northern Illinois University, Toussiant Losier of University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Vanessa Stokes. She's an artist, photographer, and entrepreneur, and a community organizer here in Chicago. So we will start with Lanie, and let me introduce her formally. Lanie Adolfson is a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of History at Northern Illinois University. She's a Chicago native who attended Chicago Public Schools and then graduated from Southern Illinois University in Carbondale with a bachelor's and a master's degree in history. The focus of Lanie's work is on the social history of medicine and the impact of healthcare disparities on people of color. Her dissertation and her talk today is titled Healthcare in the Black Metropolis, A History of Provident Hospital. Lanie, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours. Please unmute yourself and you may get started when you are ready.
I'm not able to share that right now.
You aren't? Oh, okay, hold on.
You have to.
Oh, I didn't. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me. Okay, Lanie, let me find you in my list here. I'm so sorry. I have made you a co-host now. There you go.
Good afternoon. I hope everyone can hear me. Can everyone hear me fine?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Allison, for your introduction. Thank you to the BMRC for this awesome opportunity. So I'm very grateful. Today, I am going to be discussing my dissertation research, which is the history of Provident Hospital from 1891 to 1950. I chose Provident for several reasons, but the 2 big reasons is my family history with Provident. I was born there. Several of my family members were also born at Provident and were also treated at Provident. And then 15 years later, I worked there as a teenager in the Central Supply Department. It was there that I did begin to learn somewhat about the history of the hospital. So I was always intrigued and fascinated by Provident Hospital and its history. And so as I decided to study history and then later decided to work on my Ph.D., I decided I think I might want to do a dissertation on Provident Hospital. And I'm so happy that I'm doing this research because it is absolutely awesome. So in my research, I've been looking at 4 key issues. And the 4 issues that I've been looking at is the role of the Black community in the establishment of the hospital. The second topic that I'm looking at is the impact of the Great Migration and the role of the Chicago Defender. But the fourth, while not by any means the least, is really one of the key topics that I really wanted to focus on, which is how did Provident seek to eliminate health disparities among the Black community in Chicago. Those are the very big issues that I'm looking at for my dissertation. I want to talk a little bit about the history of the hospital. The hospital was started by Dr. Daniel Hale Williams. Dr. Williams started the hospital as a result of being approached by Emma Reynolds, who was an African-American woman who wanted to go to nursing school. She had been denied repeatedly due to racism. And so Reynolds and her brother, who was a minister, approached Dr. Williams, and he began advocating for Reynolds. Still, she had problems getting into nursing school. So Dr. Williams and some other doctors decided that there needed to be a nurse training program and a hospital where African Americans could go and would not have to deal with racism or this bigotry that they might experience, especially Reynolds wanting to become a nurse. This is actually a photograph of Emma Reynolds. She would go on to graduate from the Provident nursing program in 1894. There was only 7 women who graduated from the program. One interesting fact about Emma Reynolds is that she actually went on to become a physician herself, which was extraordinary for that time period, being a woman and being a Black woman graduating and becoming a doctor. This is a photograph of the nurses in the graduate school. Well, not graduate school, but in the nursing program who graduated. That first graduation was in 1894. The first hospital was actually in a 3-story brick house there on 29th and Dearborn. And this was 12 beds. It would become the first Provident. One of the interesting things is that the second hospital was only 10 blocks away on 39th and Dearborn. This is a photograph of Ida B. Wells's home. She was the president of the Chicago Black Women's Club movement, and the Chicago Black Women's Club were very significant contributors to Provident Hospital. They sold, they made clothing, they cooked food, they just were the backbone of the hospital. They played a really pivotal role in Provident Hospital with the work that they did. And virtually, other than clinical work, they did everything in terms of hospital. So they really were that intersection between the Black Women's Club movement and Provident Hospital is very, very significant. This is Dr. George Cleveland Hall. He was also a key player at Provident. He was a doctor there, but he also established the first postgraduate courses. He would go on to become chief of staff. He was also on the board of trustees. And where his work and my research really tied together is Hall expanded the healthcare delivery services, not just for African Americans already living in Chicago, but the new migrants coming from the South. Dr. Hall played a huge role in helping them get medical care when they moved to Chicago. This was a little bit earlier, but he also founded the Cook County Physicians Association of Chicago for African American doctors. He did that in 1911. So one of the great things about this research is that I've been able to use the Chicago Defender, the Chicago Tribune, which has been absolutely wonderful during the pandemic. So as a result, I've really gained a lot of information about the hospital that will be in my dissertation. And I've addressed Dr. Hall, but he, of course, is a very serious individual that will be in the dissertation, but also the hospital began addressing the health issues very quickly. So in 1911, Provident established a TB clinic. They also focused very aggressively on infant mortality, which was a big problem. Furthermore, in 1928, the dental clinic was established, social workers were hired, and they began the Germs Have No Color campaign. By the 30s, Provident even became more aggressive in community outreach and really honing in on the problems within African Americans. As far as healthcare, one of the major issues with the dissertation is really looking at this social justice component, that Provident itself became more than a hospital. They really took on this role of looking at the social problems that were leading to African Americans having to be at the hospital. Why were they coming in? What was going on? Sorry about that. So clearly there is a lot more research to be done. These are some of the big issues I'm going to be looking at for further research. And that's looking at the class tensions between Northern Blacks and Southern Blacks. Also looking at the role of Black churches, especially Mount Olivet, Black celebrities and their role in Provident, especially Chicago celebrities or important figures. Also, the pandemic of 1918, 1919, but other historical events such as the race riots of 1919 and labor unrest and the Great Depression and World War II. All of these issues will be in my dissertation, looking at how did they affect the hospital and how the hospital provided care and treatment to African Americans. So obviously, why is this research important? Well, Provident is very fortunate that there were a lot of firsts. Provident was the first private hospital to provide internships for African American doctors. Provident was the first to establish a nursing school for African American women in Chicago. Provident, while it was not the first hospital to deal with these healthcare disparities among poor Blacks, but they were very aggressive in dealing with it. They also were the first hospital to provide the postgraduate courses for Black physicians. Another reason why the research is so important is the issue of disparities in healthcare continue to plague, particularly people of color. We saw this with the COVID, which COVID, of course, is still going on, but especially last year, African Americans died disproportionately of COVID, and so these disparities with chronic illnesses continue. So this topic continues to remain quite relevant in terms of institutional racism and these intersectionality of so many other issues. Today, it is the Provident Medical Center, but its mission is still the same despite there's been upheavals. There was times when Provident shut down, but it reopened. And so the mission has remained the same, which is to serve the poor and the underserved of Chicago, despite the financial difficulties it has experienced. Are there any questions? So thank you very much for listening and coming to the presentation, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Lanie. We will make time for questions at the end. That was wonderful. And if you will stop sharing your screen, we will move forward to hear from Dr. Toussiant Losier. All right. And let me introduce him. Dr. Losier is an assistant professor at W.E.B. Du Bois Department of African American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's been a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History and a Woodrow Wilson National Foundation Career Enhancement Fellow as well. He is a co-author of Rethinking the American Prison Movement with Dan Berger, and is preparing a book manuscript tentatively titled War for the City, Black Liberation and the Consolidation of the Carceral State. Today, Dr. Losier's talk is United in Peace, the History, Memory, and Politics of Street Gang Truces. All right. Oh, what happened here? Dr. Losier, when you're ready, you may share your screen. Toussiant?
Wonderful.
Okay. I made your co-host, so you should be able to share your screen when you're ready.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. First of all, thank you for that introduction.
All right.
And I want to just get my screen going. 1 second. All right.
Dr. Losier, can you hear me?
I was just saying that.
Okay, there you are.
First of all,
we missed your first part. I'm sorry.
No problem. First of all, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I was just kind of beginning by saying that this research project really builds on work that I've done for my first book manuscript, which really looked at the intersection between kind of the politics of the Black Power era, street gangs in Chicago, and the rise of mass incarceration in Illinois more broadly, and particularly looking at the ways in which the dynamics between those forces really shaped developments in Chicago through the 50s, 60s, all the way up through the 90s. And I ended the 90s right at the 1992 Chicago gang truce. And part of what my research project was focused on was really providing some of the kind of primary source literature for doing a deeper kind of oral history project of the 1992 Chicago gang truce. And I want to say a couple things about how I got to this project. So first and foremost, I really started thinking about a kind of deeper investigation of this project while following and doing my best to support some of the protests that were taking place back in the summer of 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri. And one of the things that that really caught my eye as I was following what was taking place in Ferguson, and then the way in which some of the protest movement that had built in Ferguson was spreading to other parts of the country, was not only the way in which the street demonstrations in Ferguson really kind of rejuvenated a particular form of kind of protest politics, particularly around issues of police violence, but as we see more broadly around a host of other issues, the way in which this kind of resurgence of movement activity also touched on the question of street gang activity. And that was a topic I was familiar with from my research. And whether it was in Ferguson, Missouri, in terms of truces that were being declared between different street gang organizations, whether it was in Baltimore, where there was a fair amount of publicity around this dynamic, or kind of more far-flung places like Raleigh, North Carolina, and Omaha, Nebraska. This was a kind of recurring theme of some of the protests that took place through 2014 and 2015, is this dynamic of kind of, in addition to having pretty substantial protests around some instances almost kind of spiraling into kind of urban rebellions around instances of police violence. There were also these declarations of street gang truces. And I found that these weren't very well covered in the media, and these oftentimes weren't very much discussed. The one time that they did seem to get a fair amount of publicity was in Baltimore, the sort of declaration of this truce between several different street gang organizations. Also, or was followed by a determination by the Baltimore police that this was sort of an effort that was specifically targeting police, and an effort to kind of create a unified effort to do harm to police officers or what have you. And this was sort of the only instances, one of the kind of few instances where I saw this sort of the discussion of this dynamic taking place in the press. And so one of the things that really got me interested in and really helped motivate me to kind of carry out this research project was trying to see what are some of the ways in which street gangs have been described, street gang truces have been described, analyzed in press accounts within Black newspapers. And in particular, really kind of interested in sort of looking into what are the ways in which this coverage might be more helpful in terms of doing oral history research on the 1992 gang truce in Chicago. And I was already familiar with the dynamic of gang truces, and particularly this relationship between gang truces and political mobilization from some of the research that I had done on an earlier kind of gang peace effort in Chicago called Lord Stones and Disciples, or LSD. And in the summer of 1969, this coalition, which had already been formed between kind of three of the most prominent Black street gang organizations earlier in the year, was a key force in protests around racial discrimination within the construction industry in Chicago. And it's not very much talked about today, but these protests shut down over about 24 construction sites around the city, held up tens of millions of dollars in federal contracts for various different buildings that were under construction, and led to a settlement that was supposed to increase opportunities for Black youth within the building trades in Chicago. And there's a whole longer conversation around the limitations of that agreement, but I was particularly interested in this sort of relationship between sort of kind of formal kind of social movement politics and sort of street organizations and street politics in that sense. And this project was also something that I was kind of interested in kind of building on some of my research on Black street gangs in prisons in Illinois, and really the ways in which the concern around a lack of control over prison institutions, questions of violence, questions of kind of illicit economies behind bars, and also the politics of these street organizations operating behind bars, the impact that these this sort of discourses around this dynamic, as well as the actual efforts to maintain control within prisons, was really a key factor in the buildup of Illinois' prison system during the course of the 1980s and 1990s, the development of more secure facilities like the TAM Supermax facility. And so I was really interested in these questions, and kind of had sort of dealt with some of the limitations of the kind of mainstream press accounts of street gangs in Illinois and street gang truces in Illinois. And after having interviewed a couple community organizers who in particular gave me some background on the 1992 gang truce, but also pointed to the ways in which prior to the gang truce that took place in Chicago in October 1992, following the tragic death of a school child in the Cabrini Green projects, there was an effort to kind of build a citywide truce, that there had actually been local neighborhood truces that had sort of laid the foundation for this effort. And so it was kind of building on some of that already conducted oral history research, as well as just kind of questions that I had, that this fellowship really was instrumental in giving me an opportunity to do kind of the equivalent of what seems relatively easy at this day and age, where you sort of use an electronic database to sort of research newspaper coverage of different topics. Because a lot of the Black newspapers, the local community newspapers, are not digitized. We have the opportunity of having a digitized database of the Chicago Defender, but some of the West Side and South Side newspapers are not digitized. And so I really use this fellowship as an opportunity to kind of old school by hand go through 3 West Side newspapers, the Austin Weekly News, the Austin Voice, and the West Side Torch, as well as the Windy City News, the Chicago Weekend Crusader, and the Hyde Park Kenwood Voice, as well as the Final Call, which is a national paper, but is not digitized in terms of its recent publications, to go through and look at coverage of the Chicago gang truces. And I just want to point to some of what I was able to find in terms of some of these, some of the ways in which the Chicago gang truce played out. And then also some of what the kind of going through these local community newspapers revealed at the same time. So to the latter point, one of the things that was particularly striking is that although these newspapers varied in terms of how frequently they published, it was particularly evident how much issues of crime and violence, as well as police violence and police corruption, were prominent topics of discussion. So this is just a kind of a couple headlines from the Austin Voice and the Windy City World, but amidst the crack cocaine epidemic and the kind of broader war on drugs, very much a focus on trying to figure out ways to crack down on criminal activity, to address, if not police corruption, at least questions of kind of poor policing in the first place of many of the communities on the South and the West Side, but also a significant concern of seeing a greater crackdown on Chicago street gangs was something that was particularly evident in some of the newspaper accounts that I found. One of the things I did find that was striking was some press coverage of kind of community meetings around building efforts at gang peace that took place prior to the start of the October 1992 gang truce. And part of what was helpful about that press coverage, which I wasn't able to find in other instances in the Chicago Tribune or even the Defender, was it's kind of that coverage has given me an opportunity to identify more other individuals that I can interview and really use those interviews as a way to continue some of the oral history research that I've been doing. And in particular, as kind of many of us might expect, the Final Call was particularly helpful in terms of providing some coverage that was also particularly useful, not necessarily in just pointing to participants in the truce, but also highlighting the role of some of the local activists who were supportive of it. And out of the research that I was able to do through this fellowship over the summer, I've been able to identify roughly 6 interview subjects to continue doing the oral history research that I really was using this fellowship to kind of provide me with a foundation for. And one of the things that I'm ultimately interested in doing is seeing the ways in which, from the kind of example of what took place in Chicago in the early 90s, look at the sort of relationship, not just in a specific sense, but almost on a sort of more theoretical sense, between efforts at building gang peace. So not simply calling for sort of crackdowns on gang activity, but supporting and helping to kind of forge gang truces, and larger political developments. And I'm most interested in kind of what that sort of kind of broader, more generalizable approach to thinking about this dynamic of gang truces, which was prominent in 1992, not just in Chicago, but in Los Angeles and other places, and actually led to the emergence of a gang peace movement, a short-lived gang peace movement that had a national resonance. But looking at what this approach might help to do in terms of serving as the sort of foundation for a more detailed and accurate accounting of the protest movement that broke out in Ferguson in 2014, and some of the other sort of recent political developments that have kind of marked our kind of political landscape over the past decade or so. So I'll leave it there, and looking forward to our discussion and any questions that folks might have.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Losier. We are going to hear next from Vanessa Stokes. And let me see here. We want to be sure that, okay, yeah, Vanessa is a co-host. All right, so Vanessa Stokes is an artist, community organizer, and owner of VS Creative Consulting, which is a community revitalization project and artist management firm here in Chicago, where the main client is Darrell Creighton, Vanessa's father. Darrell Creighton had the first Black-owned commercial photography studio in the city of Chicago, and after his death, he left behind 300,000 plus image collection. In addition, she is a cultural organizer, a curator of several public art displays in the Austin community, including 2 displays of the work of Darrell Creighton located inside the train stations at Austin and Central on CTA's Green Line. Currently, Vanessa is managing Special Service Area 72 in the Austin community and collaborating with local artists and community members, creating the future art and public art and community development on the west side of Chicago. She is president of Austin Town Hall Park Advisory Council and the chair of the Austin Town Hall Park and Art and Culture Committee. Lastly, Vanessa volunteers on the Hatchery Community Advisory Committee and on the board at the Caron Center for the Arts. Vanessa, when you are ready, you may share your screen. Let's see here. Let's see. Hold on just one moment, if you will. I think we need to make an adjustment on video. Vanessa, can you show your video? I think
Yes, you did. Thank you, Allison.
There you, okay, thank you.
And
when you're ready, you can share your screen.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you for being here today. And this has been a very interesting last couple of years. So I'm really excited to share my research, and this research has been going on for a while. So it's great to have an institution to see the work that I've been creating on the West Side. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you see that?
We can.
Okay, great. So so this is the title page. I'm sure you can all read it. And just creating just ways for the community to thrive is really, and using art as a way, art and placemaking to do that. And so here's my, Allison just went through this, so I'm just gonna leave it here and just kind of share a little bit about what this really meant for me to receive this fellowship and the work that I've been doing for the last 8 years, just building relationships with community, building relationships with different organizations. I work for a number of organizations, and actually now my company is managing SSA 72, Special Service Area 72. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a business improvement district on the west side. And then we're also in the process of creating a new special service area on Madison Avenue in West Garfield Park. For those of you that know that community or not, West Garfield Park is where at the height of 1968 riots, basically burnt down that corridor for a large part of the corridor, and has not been revitalized since 1968. So I'm really excited about continuing to build community and build businesses in this economic corridor. So I moved to the Austin community about 8 years ago. And what I really noticed coming from where I came from, I lived on the south side for about 10 years. And I grew up on the north side. So I grew up in the Lakeview community, which is very different from the west side. So the first things that I noticed was like, there's no art, there's no places for people to be, other than, you know, your park, district park, field house. And there's just a lot of devastation and lack. So I mean, I saw an opportunity to use my father's photography as a way to help cultivate and activate different areas. This image that I took, I'm also a photographer, underneath the viaduct at Laramie and Kinsey. And we used this space, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, as an art gallery. And this is my real, when things really started to move for me, was to, you know, how can we create spaces for community, and how can we activate areas that obviously need activation. So here's some of my father's images, and just to give you a little background about my dad. So my dad had the first Black-owned photography studio in Chicago, and he was a commercial photographer. Most of the work that he did was advertising photography. But as you can see here, these are some of the images that he did outside of his work as a commercial photographer. So he also has performance photography, street photography, a lot of models, and a lot of fashion, and just a lot of different types of photography, which makes his collection very unique. And we are in a conversation right now with the Smithsonian Museum of African American Art to see what's possible in actually acquiring and preserving his collection. We've been working on it for many years, and like I said, there's over 300,000 images in the collection, and so these are some of the images that we found and we scanned, and I have some more images of just street shots that he took. And it, you know, it's very inspiring going through his work. And that was part of the work that I'm doing with this research, is like continuing to be able to go through his work and just be able to organize it. So that's what we've been doing for the last, I'd say, about 10 years or so, is to organize his work. We've gotten through a majority of it, but there's still a lot for us to go through. And that's why we asked the National Museum to assist us in like organizing. So these are some of the public art displays that we created in the Austin community. Two of them are in two train stations on the Green Line, and one is on Laramie underneath a viaduct. So I saw that as a way to activate a viaduct. Like if you go to a lot of other communities, they use viaducts as galleries, right? They have all different types of art and all things underneath there. And I think that was the idea, was to continue to see these spaces as ways for us to promote and to show the community what is possible, and also the images of us, right? So folks can, they can relate, which was really important. So the research, so originally when I wrote for this fellowship, I was really interested in what other communities in Chicago, especially on the South Side, have done when it comes to research, or I'm sorry, when it comes to like art and activation. And so when I started doing my research, you know, I started to see that, you know, the South Side is very different than the West Side. It's very different, and it's really hard to compare the two because of the fact that in the Great Migration, folks that came from the South, the first wave of people in the early 1900s, they landed on the South Side. So by the 60s and 70s, when folks were coming from the South to the West Side, the South Side had been established for decades. So it's very different. And in the community on the West Side in Austin, especially, it's a very working class area, right? So as I was doing my research, I was really interested in what was going on here. What's going on the West Side? You know, what's happening here with artists, placement, creative placemaking? Like, what do the folks on the West Side, what have they done? So I started to look at the Sylvia Campbell photography of the Madison Street corridor after the riots. I looked at some images at the History Museum. I researched Eric Werner. He was kind of like my dad in a way, where he was a commercial photographer during the day, but then at some other points he did other types of photography. Abdul Ali Kalamat, sorry, he's a muralist and did the mural on the South Side, which has been praised as being one of the greatest murals in Chicago. And then I started looking around and just started talking to people. Since I have all these great relationships with people on the West Side, I just started asking folks about artists and about art and creative placemaking and what was going on when they came here in the 60s and 70s, and what kind of changes were happening in the community. And then of course, you know, I'm a lifelong Chicagoan, and kind of just putting that experience into this too. And I've lived everywhere pretty much in the city. And what I saw, which I found really interesting, so the Sylvia Campbell photographs, which were the only images that they had on the West Side of the West Side, and it was the collection was of the aftermath of 1968, which is great, but I was really looking for more images of like this life, right? Like more information about life on the West Side, and I just didn't really find a whole lot, if any, when I went to I researched Austin community at the Chicago History Museum. They had 200 images. Of those 200 images, only 28% of those images were of Black people. There were photographers who did a lot of photojournalism and things of that nature, like with Chicago Defender, the Sun-Times, and so forth. And then most of the, like I said, most of the African Americans that live here in the Austin community came in like the 60s and 70s. And a lot of the folks that I talked to, like I think everybody I talked to, said that they were never engaged with any artists on the West Side, which I found really interesting, and I definitely want to look into that more. And they didn't interact with artists at all, which I thought was very interesting. So just to show you, like, so this brings me to like, okay, what happens now, right? What's going to happen now that I have all this information? And this is the work that I've been doing for many years. And so I see the way of creating this kind of transformation on the West Side is to really activate vacant spaces, like the viaduct in like this vacant lot. So I worked with a group of people, artists, architects, designers, the Department of Planning, the mayor's office, and we created this space. It's called Pop Courts. It's on the corner of Chicago and Lockwood in the Austin community. And this space is really to help create community, a space where community can actually be and share in and own. So we had our ribbon cutting. This is a picture of the ribbon cutting we had in June. And we've continued to activate the space over the last few months, weekly, so the community can be a part of these activations. And then also continuing to work with the artist community to do murals like this. So this is a mural that we worked with an artist group to create. There's actually 2 artists in this actual mural. So, continuing to build those relationships with artists and continuing to build beautification and other ways in these corridors to build the economic development in these corridors. And then lastly, another action that I'm creating is the Austin Community Documenting and Preservation Project. So here's some of the images that I found in working on my dad's work while I was doing the fellowship. And the image of the Black Panther, what looks like a Black Panther rally and protest. It was actually taken in Sweden in 1968. So my dad lived in Sweden and started his business there. And then the picture of the Black man was also taken in Sweden. And then the picture to the left of the woman was taken here in Chicago. So I'm just really interested in what kind of images are out there in the community. And I've already talked to some community members who are willing to donate their images so we can scan them and preserve that life, those life images that have happened on the West Side. And that concludes my presentation today. This is another image of Pop Courts ribbon cutting, and just really excited to continue to do these creative placemaking spaces. I'm working with the Department of Planning in Chicago to look at other spaces in Chicago that we can create these spaces to help activate community. So thank you so much. Thank you, Allison, and everyone else.
Thank you, Vanessa. We really enjoyed that. It is now time for us to open the floor for questions that you may have. I can ask that you maybe unmute yourselves if you wish to ask a question of Lanie Adolfson, Toussiant, Losier, or Vanessa Stokes. Oh, there's one in the chat. I'll go ahead and read it. It says, Vanessa, Ms. Stokes, do you mind dropping the contact info in the chat? Thank you so much. All right. And then there was a question in the chat also. It was sort of maybe a question for Lanie, and asking if you were able to access the Provident files that are available in the archives through the Provident Foundation or not. Lanie, if not, there's a contact information, a name as a contact person for you.
Yeah, I saw that, and wait a minute, let me video. I was thrilled for the contact because I have been trying to reach out to someone who's in the foundation. I've got
wonderful
So thank you, because I
Great.
am still at the early stage. So this is awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay. Other questions?
I actually have a,
okay.
oh, I'm sorry. I have a question for, I am just really thrilled about Vanessa because I was, my dad was an artist in Chicago and a lot of his friends were, and my mom's partner is a photographer. She's retired now. So I was wondering if you were familiar with Mickey Farrell's work. She did a lot of similar work with the Nation of Islam, with taking photography, Muhammad Ali, a lot of the dance studios in Chicago, African-American dance studios. And so I was just, she would have been in your father's, contemporary of your father. So I was just wondering if you were familiar with her work also.
I am not.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in knowing.
Yes, I will send you her info in the chat room. And the other question I had, now I know I'll be brief, is what have you found to be, I know that kind of like with your dad's work and now what you're doing, kind of what do you see some of the similarities, but what are some of the differences now between the, the two periods, two generations?
That's a really good question. So I know that photography then was very different than what it is now, right? So now you can take a picture and develop it and print it all in like a span of like 5 minutes, right? So back then it was really a process. Like my dad worked a lot. Like I didn't see him most of the time because he spent most of his time in his studio, not only, practicing taking images, but then also printing. He was a master printer, so he spent a lot of time in the dark room. So I think that it's the process is different. Right. So I think that is what lends to the differences in photography now than then. I mean, I would say a lot of the people that I know, just regular folks, claim that they're photographers. They have an iPhone and, you could take a picture and, next thing you know, you got an image that's, blasted all over the world. So, I mean, I think that is very different, right? So my dad didn't really do much other than that. Like, he wasn't a business person. He wasn't a businessman. He wasn't trying to field work or any of those things. All he wanted to do was take pictures. So I think that that's another thing too, that nowadays it's like, it's completely different than back then. But I think he also wore himself out because he worked so much. And then it was very challenging being Black and being an artist. It was very challenging, and he had a lot of challenges competing with white artists. So, I think that that it, ultimately that's what stopped his business. He just didn't have the energy to do it anymore. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a completely, it's hard to, it's just different. It's completely different.
Thank you. I think I see a hand up that's been up for a little bit. Dr. Jacoby Williams, feel free to unmute yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Y'all hear me okay, I hope?
We do.
Thank you all for your presentations. I learned much today. I greatly appreciate the work that you all have contributed via the fellowship. My question is for Toussiant. It is a two-part question. I'm very interested in more information regarding LSD and in those campaigns regarding around labor and construction sites. If there is, you've encountered any information between the connection between that organization and their relationship with Jesse Jackson and Operation Breadbasket at the time. And part two, as someone who was very engaged in the gang culture in the 90s and participated in those gang truces, and if you have any information regarding my understanding of how those truces helped result in the election of Carol Moseley Braun as the first African-American female congresswoman out of Southside Chicago. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. Very much appreciate them, and love to be in more conversation with you about them. To the last question first, I don't have like specific information around how the Truces contributed to Carol Moseley Braun's election. I've heard anecdotally from people that I know who were involved in those Truces, specifically talking not just about the work of the Truce themselves, but how the sort of political space that the Truces opened up had them, doing get out the vote efforts, doing voter registration efforts, and even doing poll watching during the November 1992 election. And it's one of the topics that I'm interested in sort of digging into a bit more, but it's not one where I've gotten exactly the kind of information, aside from just people's anecdotal accounts, to really make a strong case. It's been interesting to look through some of the community newspapers, especially some of the ones that are more political, and see, some of the coverage of issues of crime and policing in them, and then also some of the political dynamics, especially with Moseley Braun's election as a senator. In regards to the first question, the LSD Coalition worked in partnership with the Coalition for United Community Action, or KUCA. And it was the kind of partnership between this gang coalition and KUCA, which was a sort of a coalition of different community and neighborhood, or different community and civil rights organizations, of which Operation Push was one, that that really were the kind of force behind this construction site protest. There's been a couple academic articles on it, and it's actually featured. And for those who are interested in photography, there's a number of pictures in a book that was recently published called Troublemakers: Chicago's Freedom Struggle Through the Lens of Art Shea. And Art Shea is a photographer who covered a number of events in Chicago, but especially covered developments during the freedom movement in the city. And he has a number of Art Shea has a number of photographs of the LSD construction site protests, and the book is alongside the photos is text from Eric Gelman, who's a historian who's written about those protests, and he has some kind of detailed description of what took place during the course of those protests. And then lastly, I would just say that while Operation Push was very much involved in the protest, Jesse Jackson got arrested during an effort to shut down construction of what's now UIC. One of the things that I was most interested in sort of covering the history of it is the way in which a lot of the political and police pressure that came down on those who were involved in the protests really frayed some of the coalition between some of the folks like Jesse Jackson and David Reed and a number of other community activists, and Leonard Singeli, Jeff Ford, folks in the conservative vice lords, and those who were very much involved in the LSD coalition. And that because of that pressure, they had a difficult time maintaining that coalition through the course of those protests and into winning the kind of settlement with the unions and the construction industry that they really wanted to see maintained.
Dr. Losier, a bit of information for you came through in the chat. Says the First Presbyterian Church records at the Newberry Library includes information about the Blackstone Rangers in the 70s. I didn't know if you had a chance to see that, because it says the Rangers used the church basement as their headquarters back then. So just a bit of information. And also, question here is, Dr. Losier said, speaking of foundations, I'm sure you've thought of this, but I remember in Natalie Moore's book on the Keystone Nation that the Ford, I think, Foundation was a funder, wondering if any funders from private foundations, Catholic Church, etc., might have records on street gangs at given moments?
Yeah, there were some foundations that had records on that have records on street gangs. I haven't been able to visit the Newberry, but that's one source that I've been interested in terms of tracking down. One of the ways that I've sort of found a roundabout way of looking at that is this obviously was a topic. The relationship between street gangs in the 60s and 70s and foundations was very much a topic that the Chicago Red Squad was interested in. And so in the at the Chicago History Museum, they have both the records of the Chicago Red Squad and then also the Chicago Gang Intelligence Unit. And the Gang Intelligence Unit has a number of files specifically dealing with the conservative vice lords and the Black Peace Donation and their foundation funding. And they sort of detail, some of those records actually detail the Gang Intelligence Unit's efforts to disrupt some of those funding efforts, both for the groups like the street gangs like the Black Peace Stones, as well as some of the more kind of community-oriented projects that they were involved in.
Great. Also, it says here, someone insists, see, Sandra Williams is letting you know that you may have checked it out already, but in case you haven't, Muhammad Speaks also covered gang activity in Chicago. And there was a question about whether or not you found anything covered, maybe in depth, perhaps, by the Chicago Reporter.
Yeah, Chicago Reporter has definitely been very helpful, both for looking at developments that took place in the late 60s and early 70s, as well as in the 90s as well too.
Okay. All right. Let's see. I don't want to miss anything. Oh, here's a question. Lanie is asking, how did the city deal with encouraging or discouraging gang truces? Can you talk more about that?
Can you ask the question again?
How did the city administrators, I guess, deal with encouraging or discouraging gang truces? Can you talk more about that?
Yeah,
How it may have evolved. You know?
There wasn't a whole lot of evolution. Well, across the decades, I would say some of the evolution has to do with, at least in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a little bit more support for those efforts, especially amongst civil rights activists, community activists, and some local officials, some of the more kind of anti-machine kind of either aldermanic candidates, and in a few instances, aldermen themselves. And up and through the 90s, it was a bit more of a controversial topic, especially, of course, this being during the war on drugs and during particularly high, violent moments of gang conflict. There were some, rather than sort of direct support from local elected officials, there's actually a fair amount of effort amongst those involved in some of these gang coalitions to run for local elected office. So you see mostly on the South Side, in the Inglewood neighborhood and other parts of the South Side, those who were involved in some of these gang coalition efforts, whether they were associated with the gangs themselves or whether they were some of the community activists who continued to provide support, that they were involved in running for office. And that created a bit more friction as well with some of the local elected officials, just because this was not just a kind of effort that would have a broader like social benefit or what have you, but it had the potential to create a political force that would be a rival one to their own, electoral base and what have you.
Great, thanks. Dr. Kimberly Black with Chicago State University is with us, and she's asking Lanie, could you talk a little bit more about the class issues between Blacks at Provident? And maybe she was thinking of that. She was thinking more about that because of the possible connection with the discussion Vanessa had, the differences Vanessa mentioned between South Side and West Side, et cetera.
Well, from almost the outset, there was this politics of respectability among African Americans. And so this idea that if your conduct would improve, then your condition would also improve. So when the Southern migrants, which the Great Migration starts in 1910, 1911, when they start coming to Chicago and then especially coming to the hospital, they're really, there's a lot of criticism of them, the way they're dressed, the way they speak, that they're not really ready for city society, that they're gonna have. So you also had like a real major paternalism from, or I guess we could say not maternalism, but there is this really strong sense that we have to train these Southern people how to behave, how to talk, how to live, how to act, because they're embarrassing us as Black people. So this was very, very significant. Chicago Defender kind of perpetuated it also with a lot of the articles that they ran, where they were talking about that, okay, when you're out in public, don't talk loud. Or when when you're coming into the hospital, this is the way you should act. So the class divisions were huge, mostly geared at Southerners, Southern Blacks, but there was some of that at Northern African Americans, that if somebody got stabbed in a bar, they were blamed for getting stabbed. So you're filling up the emergency room with these conflicts. So stop behaving this way. So this politics of respectability, there was also the light skin, dark skin dynamic, colorism. That part was a little bit more subtle, but in the advertisements in the Defender, it was very obvious who they thought was beautiful and who they thought was attractive. Or up until the 50s, you saw that. But yeah, that played a huge role. I saw in the chat room, someone said that their mother was treated poorly because they were poor. I'm not surprised at that. That was a big issue, unfortunately, at the hospital, that the judgment was put on you. My grandmother, who had chronic hypertension, was at the Provident all the time. She was constantly there. And over time, she was blamed too. I mean, when they would see her coming in, they would say, well, you wouldn't have to be coming in here all the time if you'd stop eating, fried pork chops all the time, or this and that. So it was still like you were being blamed for your health situation. And of course, so there was a problem. And also another big area is doctors and nurses at Provident. They clearly saw themselves, not all, but many of them felt they were better than the patients that they were treating. And that was talked about in subtle comments. So to answer the question without being extremely long-winded, well, I've just been long-winded, the class issue was quite significant, especially with the Southern migrants. It was more glaring with them.
Lanie, I have a question. I was wondering if there were did you come across in your research any partnerships with perhaps predominantly white hospitals or medical associations of any sort that were attempting to be helpful in any way, whether that was with teaching training, or just in any way? Did you come across any of such partnership?
Yes. Dr. Vanessa Northington Gamble has written extensively actually about that topic. The University of Chicago in the 1920s and 30s, well, primarily the 30s, but 20s and 30s, were partners with Provident. They were allowing African-American medical students to go there for classes and training. And it was always a very precarious relationship. But the problem where Dr. Gamble talks about this in her work about Provident, she does, it's not only about Provident, but it's a chapter in her book. But she talks about the fact that the problem is that at the University of Chicago, the Black medical doctors were not, student doctors were not allowed to do any clinicals at the University of Chicago. They can only do their clinicals at Provident. So, and the Defender covered that day and night. I mean, it was widespread. So, I mean, but Provident for a long time could maintain that relationship with the university because there were benefits for African-American medical students. But yes, the hospital did. Now, as far as white philanthropy, that was huge. There were many, many whites who provided financial support to Provident Hospital. What I gather from the preliminary research, a lot of that was so that Black people would not come to white hospitals. So there was this, it's that if we make sure that Provident is well-funded, well-staffed, well-trained, well-qualified, then they won't need to be coming to our hospitals. We'll help with that. Now, I'm sure there was some goodwill there, but even the Chicago Tribune said Black people need their own hospital. You know, the Negroes need their own hospital. And that was the consensus that, yeah, this is a good thing. We need to support this.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay, Vanessa, and forgive me if you mentioned this, but I do wonder if in your efforts in working with the West Side communities, there are any programs that maybe you work with or you have perhaps advised that will help to bring the young kids into, you know, the art world, particularly photography. You know, because there are many young people who might develop an interest if they only had the exposure and the equipment, you know.
Yeah, I
although
mean,
a phone is a camera, but just
Yeah.
sort of the rest of it, though, the rest of the knowledge that you have to become a really great photographer.
Yeah, so I have been in conversation with just other organizations and seeing how we can create a photography program. So Heartland Alliance is one of the largest nonprofit organizations in the world, I believe. And they have a site in Austin. And I was in conversation with the executive director for that organization, who actually is a photographer by trade. And he's from Israel, he's Israeli, and he worked a lot in Israel, trying to build relations between Israel and Palestine. And so we were talking about how, you know, photography can be used to have young people look through a different lens. And then, you know, so I'm in conversation with organizations and how to create like an actual program, but a darkroom photography program, right?
Wonderful.
Yeah, so I mean, it's definitely something that's in my sights and something I'm very interested in because we do have such great schools for photography in Chicago with the Art Institute, and even the Harold Washington College, they have a photography program there too. So, you know, just getting young people involved in art is definitely one of the things that I'm working on.
Wonderful. Good to hear. Do we have other questions for the speakers? Any one of the speakers? Did I miss anything in the chat? My colleagues who are online, can you just help me make sure I didn't miss any others in the chat? I will say that there are a few things that are in the chat that I think, Dr. Losier, you've seen a few things that people pointed out that were meant just for you. And all right. Well, It is a little, let's see, 1:17. And I think if we don't have any other questions, we will close it out. This again was our third session of a 3-part series for the fellows, the BMRC fellows. And we thank each of our speakers today, Vanessa Stokes, Lanie Adolfson, and Dr. Toussiant Losier. We also hope that those attending today will keep track of what's happening with the Black Metropolis Research Center. If you're not following us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whatever of those are your social media of choice, please do so. We have other upcoming events, and just periodically check in with us so that you can keep abreast of what's happening. And you will hear more from our fellows in the future. And we will very soon open the application section for 2022 cohort for the BMRC fellows. So you can keep track of that by just checking our website. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.